Jasmine had always been someone who carried herself with a quiet strength, walking through the world with purpose even when the world seemed determined to look at her differently. The heavy weight of her pregnancy didn't slow her down. She knew what it was like to face the judgmental eyes of strangers, the quiet whispers in the background, the stares that followed her as she moved through places. But today she was determined to get through her errands with as little fuss as possible. Her mind was occupied with thoughts of her unborn child and the future that awaited them both. She had been feeling the subtle kicks inside her belly, and each time she smiled to herself, thinking about the little one growing stronger with each passing day. But today was different. Today was heavier somehow, as if the air around her carried something unseen. A tension she couldn't quite put her finger on it seemed to thicken as she walked through the streets. Something in the atmosphere was shifting. The usual humdrum of everyday life felt more charged today. The quiet buzz of people talking softly on their phones, the distant sounds of car engines, the occasional dog barking, they all seemed more urgent, more tense than usual. As she rounded the corner of the block, her footsteps echoing on the pavement, she saw the flashing lights of a police car up ahead. At first, she thought it was just another routine patrol, but as she approached, something in the air shifted again. She couldn't quite shake the feeling of being watched, the kind of feeling you get when someone is sizing you up. She glanced sideways and saw Officer Daniels standing near his patrol car, his eyes fixed on her. And for some reason it felt different this time. It felt like more than just a passing glance. It felt like an assessment, like she was being judged without her even having a chance to explain herself. Her instincts kicked in, and she straightened her posture, her hand instinctively resting on her stomach. As she continued walking, her heart started to race a little faster, but she didn't slow down. She wouldn't let herself. It wasn't that she was afraid, it was that she knew how this moment could go. It was the knowing that came from years of experience, walking through life as a black woman in a world where the color of your skin often dictated the way people saw you. Jasmine had long ago learned how to brace herself for these moments, the ones where her presence was questioned, where she was seen as a suspect before being seen as a person. She had learned to carry herself with an air of confidence, a shield to protect herself from the weight of others' judgments. But today the air felt different, and she couldn't quite figure out why. Officer Daniels stepped forward, his boots clicking sharply on the sidewalk as he made his way toward her, his gaze never wavering. She could see the way his eyes scanned her body from head to toe. There was no warmth in his look, only suspicion, no curiosity, only assumption. And that was the moment she knew this wasn't going to be a simple encounter. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach, a tension that grew with each step he took toward her. And just as quickly as it started, it became clear this moment was about to change everything. Officer Daniels had been patrolling this neighborhood for years, and his instincts were sharp. He knew the area better than anyone, the quiet streets, the places where trouble tended to hide, and the people who often caused it. But today, something about Jasmine caught his attention. Her presence seemed out of place. She was a young woman walking alone in a part of town where few chose to walk without a purpose, and certainly not at this hour. He had seen her approaching from a distance, and something in the back of his mind told him to keep an eye on her. Maybe it was the way she carried herself, like she knew she belonged here. Maybe it was the fact that she was black, or maybe it was just his intuition telling him that something was off. Whatever it was, it made him feel uneasy, and as a cop it was his job to act on that feeling. He rolled down his window and watched as she continued to walk down the sidewalk, unaware of the scrutiny falling upon her. He didn't like it when people walked around like they had nothing to hide, like they weren't worried about what people thought of them. It made him suspicious, especially in an area like this where crime had been on the rise for months now. It wasn't until she got closer that Daniels made his decision, his mind made up about who she was and what she was doing there. The moment she got within range, he slammed the car door and stepped out onto the sidewalk, his heavy boots hitting the pavement with purpose. The sound of his footsteps cut through the tense silence like a warning. Jasmine hadn't noticed him approaching at first, but the moment she did, she could feel his eyes on her, and she knew what was coming. She had felt it in her bones from the moment she saw the police car. She knew the drill. She knew how this would unfold before it even started. She stopped walking and turned to face him, her posture straight. But she kept her distance, not wanting to make any sudden movements. Officer Daniels walked up to her With a sense of authority that could have easily turned into aggression, his hand hovered near his belt, as though he was preparing himself for whatever might come next. And then he spoke, his voice loud and direct. "Ma'am, I need you to stop right there." She didn't flinch. She didn't back down. She stood her ground the way she had been taught to by her parents, by the streets, by life itself. "I'm not doing anything," she said evenly, her voice calm despite the adrenaline running through her veins. Officer Daniels took a step closer, and that was when Jasmine's heart began to race. She could feel the pressure mounting, the tension thickening between them. She had been here before. She had been stopped and questioned too many times to count. She knew the drill, and yet something about this felt different today. It felt like she wasn't just being stopped by a cop. It felt like she was being stopped by the world itself, as if every person who had ever looked at her and assumed the worst was being represented in this moment. And she wasn't sure how much longer she could take it. Daniels didn't pause. He wasn't interested in hearing what she had to say, not yet anyway. He was already assuming he knew who she was and why she was there. His eyes narrowed as he gave her a quick once-over, and then he spoke again. "I'm going to need to see some ID." Jasmine didn't react right away. Instead, she took a slow breath and steadied herself. "I'm with the FBI," she said finally, her voice steady and firm. Daniels didn't seem to hear her at first. He didn't even blink. His eyes remained fixed on her, like he hadn't heard a word she said. He stepped closer, still his presence overwhelming her. Every instinct screamed at her to be cautious, to be ready. But she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about a routine stop, not this time. Officer Daniels stared at her for a moment, as if the words she had spoken hadn't registered in his mind. He blinked slowly and took a step closer, as though he needed to scrutinize her even more. Jasmine stood her ground, even though her pulse was beginning to race faster. Her eyes never left his, and her hand remained lightly on her stomach, instinctively protecting the life growing inside her. She could feel the weight of his gaze as it roamed over her, not just evaluating her, but judging her, a look she had grown all too familiar with. It wasn't just the uniform that made him feel like a threat. It was everything about the way he carried himself, the way he spoke as though he had already made up his mind about who she was, the way his posture was full of authority, even without a hint of interest in hearing her side of the story, the way he had already assumed the worst of her simply because of her skin color. And where she was walking, it wasn't lost on her. She had seen it too many times before. The racial profiling that ran deep in some police forces, the snap judgments made because of someone's appearance, the hidden biases that played out in real time. She had learned to brace herself for it, even though it always hurt the same way. She hadn't expected this, not here, not today. But somehow she had known deep down that this moment was coming. Daniels continued to look her up and down, as if waiting for her to prove herself to him. But Jasmine held her ground. "I'm telling you, I'm with the FBI," she repeated, her voice steady, but with a hint of frustration. Now the words hung in the air between them, but Daniels didn't seem to register them. He didn't move or shift his gaze. He didn't even respond for a moment, which made Jasmine feel the sting of doubt creeping in. Was he going to listen to her? Or was he going to continue pushing her as if she were nothing more than a suspect? His next words cut through the tension, but they weren't what she expected. He didn't apologize or show any sign of reconsideration. He just took another step forward, his hand inching closer to his belt, as if preparing for something. He seemed ready for an escalation, and Jasmine braced herself. Her heart pounded in her chest, her body tense. With the sudden danger in the air, Officer Daniels wasn't just dismissing her. He was challenging her in a way that was both subtle and terrifying. She had felt it before, that unease when authority figures looked at her not as a person but as a problem, something to control or fix. But she wouldn't back down. She couldn't let herself back down. She knew the stakes were higher now, not just for her, but for every black woman who had ever faced the same assumptions. She had the right to stand here. She had the right to be who she was. And she had the right to walk down this street without fear of being treated like a criminal. Still, Daniels didn't move to let her go. Instead, he kept pressing his line of questioning, like her words meant nothing, like her identity meant nothing, like she wasn't a person at all. Jasmine felt the pressure growing inside her. It was like the air around them had thickened with every passing second. Her mind raced as she tried to think of something that would convince him to stop. She tried to stay calm, but in her gut, she knew that this situation wasn't just about her identity. It was about something much larger, about the prejudices that controlled how people like her were treated by those who held power and control over her fate. And yet, no matter how many times she repeated her position, he wasn't willing to listen. Daniels wasn't about to let her go so easily. He was already forming his next move without ever questioning whether or not he was wrong. He just assumed she was another person to be dealt with. The tension between them grew with every passing second. Jasmine could feel her body trembling just slightly beneath the surface, her heart thudding in her chest, as she tried to maintain control of the situation. She had learned to keep calm in moments like these, to stand tall in the face of judgment, even when the world around her wanted to break her down. Officer Daniels seemed unaware of the weight. He was adding to her anxiety as he stood just a few feet away, continuing to evaluate her. With a gaze that felt like it was cutting straight through her, she could feel the heat of his scrutiny, and every step he took closer made her heart race faster, his hand still hovering near his belt, like he was waiting for an excuse to escalate the situation, like he was waiting for her to make a wrong move. His eyes didn't soften. There was no sign of recognition, no acknowledgement of her words, or the possibility that she was telling the truth. His stance remained rigid, almost defensive, and Jasmine's mind raced with the realization that this wasn't just about her walking down the street. It was about something far deeper, something that she couldn't change in this moment, something that she couldn't make him see just by speaking the truth. He was caught up in his own assumptions and prejudice, and there was nothing she could do to make him see beyond them. The minutes felt like hours, each one stretching out longer than the last, as Officer Daniels stood in front of her, unblinking and unyielding. His silence only added to the pressure building in Jasmine's chest. She could feel the anger rising within her, but she fought to suppress it. She couldn't afford to lose control, not now, not when everything was on the line. Her unborn child was right there with her, and the fear of something going wrong made every breath feel like a heavy burden. She had seen how quickly situations like this could turn dangerous. She had seen too many stories of black people being wrongfully detained, or worse, because of a single officer's decision to ignore the truth of who they were. But Jasmine wasn't just any woman. She was someone who knew her rights, and she wasn't going to back down. She wasn't going to let him get away with treating her like she was invisible, like her words didn't matter. Officer Daniels seemed to realize that something wasn't quite adding up, but he didn't show it. His face was hard as stone, and his grip remained near his belt, ready to act if needed. The longer they stood there, the more Jasmine could feel the tension in the air. It was suffocating and heavy, like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. But what was he waiting for? What did he need from her? What more could she say to prove she wasn't the person he had decided she was? She could see it in his eyes, the doubt creeping in. But he refused to show it, refusing to acknowledge that she might just be telling the truth. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke again, his voice colder this time, with no hint of apology in his tone. "Ma'am, I'm still going to need to check your identification. I'm not taking your word for it." Jasmine's stomach dropped. She had expected something like this, but it didn't make it any easier to hear. She had told him who she was, and still he refused to listen. She couldn't understand why her simple words weren't enough, why her identity meant so little to him, why he was determined to keep her under suspicion. It was like every ounce of her humanity was being stripped away with every word he spoke. His refusal to accept her as who she said she was a sharp reminder of the reality she faced every day. But despite the frustration and anger bubbling inside of her, Jasmine kept her composure. She couldn't lose it now. Her eyes locked onto his with steady defiance, and she said it once more, "I am with the FBI." But this time something had changed in her voice. It wasn't just the words anymore. It was the quiet authority that came with them. It was the certainty she had in knowing exactly who she was and what she represented, even if he refused to see it. Officer Daniels seemed unmoved by her calm insistence. His eyes flickered, but there was no sign of recognition, no sign of acknowledgement of her words, as if he had already dismissed her as a liar, or as someone trying to avoid the inevitable. He stepped even closer now. His body language was rigid, his presence almost suffocating, and Jasmine felt her patience thinning. She could feel the sweat beading on her forehead. Despite the chill in the air, she had always prided herself on her ability to stay composed. But today her composure was being tested in ways she had never imagined. The officer's refusal to believe her felt like an assault on her very identity, her dignity, her rights, and the reality of it was beginning to sink in deeper with every second that passed. She had spoken the truth. She had told him who she was. She had nothing left to prove yet. He stood there continuing to challenge her like her words didn't matter, like she didn't matter. She had seen it all before, the systemic bias, the refusal to trust her simply because of the color of her skin, and the way that people in authority wielded their power over her and others. Like her, she knew what this moment was, but still it stung. She wasn't just a woman trying to get through her day. She wasn't just a pregnant woman on her way to run errands. She was someone who had earned her place in the world. And yet here she was standing in front of a man who refused to see her for who she truly was. Jasmine's mind raced through the possibilities. What would it take for him to listen? Was she going to have to show him her badge? Was she going to have to escalate this further just to prove she wasn't who he thought she was? And yet she had already given him the truth. She had already offered him her identity with no hesitation. And still he was demanding more, demanding something she couldn't give, because he refused to believe her. Still the pressure was mounting, and the longer they stood there, the more Jasmine felt like she was suffocating in the moment. Officer Daniels didn't seem to notice how much he was pushing her, how much he was challenging her. He was just doing his job in his mind. She was just another person to deal with, another potential criminal in a neighborhood that had seen its share of problems. He wasn't seeing the woman in front of him, the person with a family who was carrying a child, the FBI agent who had worked hard to get to where she was. None of that mattered to him. What mattered was his assumption that she was guilty of something that wasn't even real. Jasmine clenched her fists at her sides, trying to stay grounded, trying to breathe through the mounting frustration. But it was hard. With every word he said, she could feel the ground shifting beneath her feet. His refusal to listen was a constant reminder that for some people she would never be enough. She would never be seen for who she was, despite the fact that she had worked tirelessly to get to where she was in life. Her words had been dismissed, her identity had been stripped away, and the fight was becoming more exhausting than she could have imagined. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of standing face to face with the officer, the sound of footsteps interrupted the tense silence. Jasmine's head snapped toward the noise. In an instant, a figure was emerging from the corner of her vision. A man was walking briskly toward them, his eyes scanning the scene. And as he got closer, Jasmine recognized him immediately. It was someone who had seen her on the news, someone who knew exactly who she was. His voice rang out clearly as he approached the officer, and in that moment everything shifted. The tension in the air seemed to dissipate. The weight that had been bearing down on her started to lift as the new arrival stepped forward, and in a calm voice confirmed what Jasmine had been saying all along. The man who stepped forward was a local resident, someone who had seen Jasmine on the news. More than once he had recognized her the moment he saw her standing there with Officer Daniels, and now he was walking toward them with purpose, his face serious, but not without a hint of recognition. As he closed the distance between them, he looked directly at Officer Daniels, and without hesitation spoke up, "Hey man, I know who she is. She's with the FBI." His words cut through the tension like a knife. The air seemed to shift instantly. Jasmine felt a rush of relief flood through her, but she also felt a surge of frustration. How had it taken someone else to finally confirm her identity? Why hadn't her own words been enough? Officer Daniels didn't react immediately. His eyes flickered between Jasmine and the newcomer, still unsure whether to accept the confirmation or dismiss it as another lie. But the witness was persistent. "I've seen her on TV. She's an agent," he continued, his voice steady and calm despite the tension in the air. Officer Daniels paused for a moment, his gaze still locked on the witness, but his posture seemed to loosen just slightly. He took a step back, still not fully convinced, but willing to listen now. After a long moment, he finally turned his attention back to Jasmine and asked in a quieter tone, still trying to hold on to some semblance of authority, "Do you have any ID on you?" Jasmine took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. This was at the moment that would either resolve everything or drag it out even longer. She knew she had the identification with her. Her badge was clipped to her belt, but something inside her was still angry that she had to prove herself yet again despite her clear explanation. But she couldn't let that anger take over. Not now, not when things were starting to shift. She nodded, slowly reaching for her badge. With a practiced motion, she pulled it out, and held it out toward Officer Daniels. He glanced at it briefly, his eyes scanning the information, but he still didn't seem fully convinced. He ran his fingers over the edges of the card, as if searching for some flaw, some indication that it wasn't real, but Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't move an inch as he studied it. She kept her eyes on him, her expression calm and controlled despite the chaos of emotions swirling inside her. The witness who had spoken up earlier stood off to the side, watching the exchange with an unreadable expression. Still, he was watching and waiting, ready to speak up again, if necessary. Officer Daniels finally looked up from the badge and met Jasmine's gaze, his face unreadable. For a moment, the silence between them felt heavy, as if the weight of everything they had just experienced was hanging in the balance. His grip on his authority seemed to waver just slightly, but he didn't apologize, not yet. Instead, he simply nodded once, still holding onto his sense of control, before turning his attention to the witness who had stepped in to vouch for Jasmine. "Are you sure about this?" the officer asked, his voice sounding almost defensive. The witness didn't hesitate. "Yeah, I'm sure. I know who she is." Jasmine could feel the heat of the moment starting to dissipate as the tension eased, but it didn't make her feel better. Not really. The damage had already been done. Officer Daniels had questioned her at every turn, without once considering that she might be telling the truth, without once questioning his assumptions about who she was and why she was there. The frustration still simmered inside her, but she forced herself to keep it together, because she knew if she didn't, the situation could spiral out of control. She had no choice but to stay calm, no matter how much it stung, no matter how much it hurt to be dismissed for something she couldn't change. But as Officer Daniels finally stepped back and began to lower his posture ever so slightly, Jasmine felt the smallest flicker of victory. It wasn't much, but it was enough to let her breathe again. Officer Daniels stood there for a moment, still processing everything that had just unfolded. His gaze shifted from the badge back to Jasmine, then to the witness standing beside them. He seemed almost lost in his thoughts, like he was trying to piece together a puzzle that didn't quite fit the way he had expected it to. Jasmine could feel the sting of his silence, but she kept her composure, her body still tense. Though the immediate threat of escalation had passed, she was aware of how easily things could shift again, how quickly the power dynamics could return to being in his favor. She held her breath, waiting for the moment to pass, waiting for the apology or the acknowledgement that would never come. It was a small victory, but it was a hollow one. She had been right all along, but it felt like she had been forced to prove herself in a way no one else would have to, as if her identity could be questioned with such ease, because of the color of her skin, because of the assumptions he had made about her before even speaking to her. Officer Daniels finally took a step back, his eyes no longer holding the same suspicion, but his body language was still rigid, as if he wasn't sure how to handle the situation now that it had shifted so dramatically. He glanced at the witness once more, as though seeking confirmation, but the man was already looking away, not interested in sticking around any longer. After all, he had done what he needed to do. He had spoken up and made sure Jasmine wasn't treated unfairly anymore, but there was no comfort in that, not for her. Jasmine turned her gaze back to the officer who had stood before her so unyielding moments ago, and now seemed less certain. She could feel the weight of everything he had put her through, the questioning, the assumptions, the almost automatic decision to treat her like a suspect. The entire ordeal had been a reminder of the ugliness she knew existed in the world of policing, but also a reminder of how powerful the system was in shaping how people were viewed and treated. Her mind was still spinning, but she knew she had to take control of the situation. She wouldn't let herself be defined by what had just happened. She wouldn't let herself be reduced to a moment of discrimination. She had a job to do, she had a future to look forward to, and a family to protect, and she wouldn't let this moment ruin that. Still, the silence stretched on, and she could feel the sting of it. Despite the resolution of the immediate danger, she wasn't sure if Daniels would offer an apology or even express any regret for how he had treated her, but she wasn't holding her breath for it. He didn't know her, that after all he had only done what he had been taught to do: act first, ask questions later. He had been trained to assume that people like her were threats, and that assumption had been so deeply ingrained that it had blinded him to the truth, even when it was staring him in the face. Jasmine clenched her jaw. She wasn't interested in his apology. She didn't need it. but she would carry the weight of this moment for a long time. The injustice of it would stay with her. It would be a reminder that no matter how far she had come in her career, how many times she had proven herself to be capable, how many people she had helped or protected, it didn't matter in moments like these. She was still judged by the color of her skin and the assumptions people like Officer Daniels made about her. She took a deep breath and exhaled slowly, steadying herself. As she looked directly at the officer again, "You're free to go," he finally said, his voice low and lacking in conviction. It wasn't an apology, but it was an end to the confrontation. Still, the damage had been done, the moment had passed, but the emotional weight would linger as Jasmine turned away from him and started to walk down the street again. Her mind raced with thoughts of everything she had just endured. She wasn't sure what to feel, whether she should be angry, relieved, or simply exhausted. The only thing she knew for certain was that this was far from over, and that she couldn't let moments like these define her future, even if they left scars on her soul. Jasmine continued walking, her footsteps slow but steady, her mind swirling with the aftermath of what had just happened. It felt surreal, the way her body had been put on trial in front of a stranger, and yet in some ways it wasn't unfamiliar. She had faced this before. She had experienced the humiliation of being stopped, questioned, and treated like she didn't belong in spaces where she had every right to be. This moment was another reminder that her identity, her worth, could be questioned at any time. No matter how many accomplishments she had under her belt, no matter how hard she had worked to earn her place in the world, she was still a black woman walking in a society that had not yet learned to see her fully or fairly. Her gaze remained focused ahead, but her mind replayed the events over and over. The officer's refusal to believe her, his quick judgment based on the color of her skin, his unwillingness to see her as anything more than what he had assumed she was, his slow crawl toward acknowledging the truth. But only after the intervention of someone else. The anger rose within her again, but this time it was tempered with something else, a deep sadness that had always been there beneath the surface, a sadness she had carried with her for so long, but had learned to bury beneath layers of strength and resilience. It was a sadness that came from knowing she could never truly rest in her own skin, that every day would require her to prove herself again and again, just to exist without fear of being treated like an outsider. Despite being born in this country, raised in it, working to protect it, and contributing to it in every way she could. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she pulled it out quickly. It was a text from her partner asking if everything was okay. She stopped for a moment and read the message. He was concerned, but she didn't want to burden him with this. Not yet, not when the emotional weight was still too heavy. She typed back, "I'm fine, just a little shaken. But I'll be all right." The words were easier to write than to feel, but she couldn't let herself dwell on it too long. She had things to do, places to be, and people to protect. She couldn't let this experience pull her off course. Still, as she walked, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was as if the entire world was waiting for her to slip up, for her to make one wrong move, so that they could justify the treatment she had just endured. The world often felt like a place where she was constantly under surveillance, where her every move was monitored by people who never took the time to understand her, who didn't care to see the complexities of her existence, the layers that made her who she was. But at the same time, she couldn't afford to let that stop her. She couldn't let the weight of other people's prejudices control her path. She had a responsibility to keep moving forward, no matter what. She would be stronger than the prejudice she faced, and despite everything she had been through that day, she knew deep down that she was capable of doing more than just surviving. She was capable of thriving. She had already proven that to herself time and time again. This moment was just another hurdle, one more instance in a lifetime of fighting for recognition, respect, and dignity. And though the emotional scars would remain, she knew that they wouldn't define her. Her strength was what would define her. She had always known the road ahead would be difficult, but moments like these reminded her of why she had chosen the path she had chosen, why she had entered the FBI, and why she refused to let anyone diminish her, her role, her purpose, her very humanity. It was because of moments like this that she had to keep going, and no matter how hard it became, no matter how exhausting it was, she knew she couldn't stop fighting for herself, for her future, for the lives she was working to protect, for every person who was still struggling to be seen and heard in a world that often tried to silence them.